7 impossible systems carried the same mark, PS4. A satellite below the horizon. A seismic return beneath the crust. A dose without radiation. Living seed. Data. An unauthorized root key. Steel without a furnace. Snow without matter. The Institute maintains the country's traceability chain for time, mass, length, radiation, chemistry, data integrity, and environmental measurement. The investigation into primary standard began at a national metrology institute with vibration-isolated chambers, polished granite benches, vacuum instruments, archival calibration rooms, and guarded vaults. Certificates from the 7 investigations referenced PS4 as their highest authority, but the Institute's asset registry contained no corresponding standard. The opening exhibit for primary standard pairs the last normal maintenance entry with a pre-incident photograph of the site. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Dr. Imani Shah, Director of Primary Standards, preserved the first local record before any reset or maintenance action. Certificates from the 7 investigations referenced PS4 as their highest authority, but the Institute's asset registry contained no corresponding standard. In the file for primary standard, the account was checked against access control, clock records, and original instrument output. The PS4 statement was recorded before shift change and reconciled with badge entries, calls, and handwritten notes. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under first operator statement without using the operational interface. Every operational instrument must trace through documented comparisons to a recognized primary standard with an unbroken chain of uncertainty and custody. At National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex, the PS4 reading passed the safeguards intended to reject false data instead of entering through an undocumented feature. This distinction is central to primary standard. The system did not merely display a value, it admitted that value as evidence. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous system function value, separating absence from disagreement. The first PS4 operational log fixed the event at 9:0. Certificates from the 7 investigations referenced PS4 as their highest authority, but the Institute's asset registry contained no corresponding standard. At National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex, no warning was generated because the system classified the reading as internally valid. The raw PS4 log was exported before restart, preserving counters and values the interface normally rounds away. Exhibit 4 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex before it entered the final record. Investigators opened primary standard with a conventional explanation. Auditors suspected a reused project code. The references crossed unrelated departments and decades, always occupying the same position in the traceability chain. The first theory in the PS4 file remained provisional until evidence could reproduce it or remove it. For primary standard, investigators wrote the expected result in advance so interpretation could not be adjusted after the test. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The PS4 event was not confined to one instrument. Paper archives, microfilm, signed software releases, and engraved hardware labels all contained PS4. No single person or database could have inserted every reference. In primary standard, agreement between separate references removed the easiest fault theory without locating a physical source. The independent PS4 instruments used different power, clocks, sensors, and processing paths. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under independent confirmation without using the operational interface. The investigation into primary standard changed when the reading produced a material consequence. A locked vault shelf reserved for primary standard 4 was empty but carried fresh pressure marks in its dust, as if a rectangular object had recently been removed. Staff documented the PS4 effect independently of the primary software. The primary standard file added photographs, mechanical indicators, and passive records because software agreement alone was insufficient. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous physical evidence value, separating absence from disagreement. For primary standard, archive staff searched maintenance files, procurement ledgers, and retired procedures. Records of a 1989 laboratory fire showed 3 primary references destroyed during a national emergency exercise. A 4th instrument was listed only as present, reading accepted. The PS4 reference predated the active equipment and was absent from routine training. The archived PS4 copy carried custody marks from before the current staff, vendor, and control system existed. Exhibit 8 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex, before it entered the final record. The PS4 anomaly returned under a repeatable condition. After the fire, PS4 appeared whenever independent systems agreed on a value that lacked a physical standard. Each later certificate cited the earlier consensus. The regularity of primary standard allowed deliberate testing and made random noise progressively less credible. Each recurrence of primary standard preserved the same order while environmental conditions changed around it. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. A full isolation was performed for primary standard. Shaw separated the Institute's networks and removed all digital indexes. The same chain emerged from handwritten comparison books stored in different buildings. The PS4 reading survived removal of the systems most likely to generate, replay, or relay it. Isolation in PS4 removed network input, automatic repair, remote support, and every scheduled process. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under isolation test without using the operational interface. Evidence outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex changed the scale of primary standard. Foreign laboratories found PS4 values embedded in shared calibration tables, although none recognized the authority named BOT. The external PS4 record had been preserved before investigators disclosed their own result. External evidence for primary standard arrived with its own timestamps and chain of custody, not as a reconstruction. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous external corroboration value, separating absence from disagreement. The primary standard team examined physical samples and passive records next. The 4mm ceramic grains, radiation cards, seed checksum, root key slot, alloy coupon, and snow load file all matched materials or dimensions used in the 1989 standards complex. The PS4 findings confirmed an effect without identifying an ordinary transfer of matter or energy. Control samples in PS4 were handled beside the affected material to compare contamination and storage directly. Exhibit 12 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex before it entered the final record. The S4 anomaly then affected operations rather than observation alone. Revoking PS4 would invalidate decades of traceability for critical infrastructure. Retaining it meant accepting a standard with no object, owner, or uncertainty budget. In primary standard, staff had to choose between an impossible measurement and the public function built around it. By this stage of primary standard, ignoring the reading carried a measurable operational cost. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Containment for primary standard was attempted under written order. The Institute froze new certificates and ordered every affected sector onto independent physical references. Several systems immediately lost agreement and attempted to recreate their PS4 behavior. The PS4 response suggested recognition of system function rather than attachment to one original device. The PS4 containment order defined success before execution. The system met the restriction by moving the effect. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under containment order without using the operational interface. Analysts reviewing primary standard compared raw signals, derived values, and each software decision. PS4 was not a hidden machine. It was a rule. When three independent measurements converged, their consensus could temporarily become the primary reference. The precision in PS4 resembled a standard more than an uncontrolled malfunction. The primary standard reviews separated what sensors observed from what software inferred because those layers changed differently. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous data review value, separating absence from disagreement. The strongest conventional explanation for primary standard was tested directly. The rule alone could explain administrative acceptance, but not hot steel, mechanical snow load, or physical changes in passive dosimeters. The proposed explanation in the PS4 file failed against independent instruments and custody records. Investigators retain the rejected PS4 explanation, including the strongest evidence that first supported. Exhibit 16 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement Primary Standards Complex before it entered the final record. The oldest file relevant to primary standard belonged to an emergency standards project. Surviving meeting notes revealed that the 1989 emergency test included 4 instruments. 3 were named. The fourth column contained readings but no model, serial, or operator. The PS4 document placed continuity of measurement above custody of a particular device. PS4 first appears in primary standard as authority for accepting a reference, not as a device serial. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The first controlled primary standard test changed one variable and registered every expected outcome in advance. Investigators recreated the test with 3 modern standards and an empty position on the granite bench. The 3 instruments disagreed within normal uncertainty. The PS4 anomaly followed the formal condition rather than incidental activity. The first PS4 test changed one registered variable while passive controls remained outside the procedure. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under controlled test A without using the operational interface. A second PS4 test removed the assumption used in the first. When the empty position was entered as PS4, every instrument shifted to a new common value outside its previous uncertainty range. The second result in primary standard narrowed the mechanism while making the physical evidence harder to explain. The second primary standard test removed formal recognition from one object and applied it to another. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous controlled test B value, separating absence from disagreement. The primary standard event escalated before testing could be closed. Mass, length, voltage, and time standards changed together while remaining internally consistent. The room's environmental sensors reported no cause. From that point, PS4 no longer fit the category of calibration irregularity. Emergency limits were crossed during PS4, forcing containment to take priority over additional measurement. Exhibit 20 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement Primary Standards Complex before it entered the final record. A separate system then reproduced or accepted the PS4 condition. Remote laboratories following the live comparison shifted by the same normalized amount, even after the data link was cut. The connection in primary standard was procedural and documentary. No normal data path accounted for it. The second institution in primary standard had not received case details, ruling out instructed behavior. For PS4, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. An independent audit reconstructed primary standard from original media. The original chart from 1989 showed the fourth trace beginning before the emergency test and continuing after the recorder was unplugged. The PS4 audit found no single fraud, hidden device, or common component capable of producing every observation. Auditors rebuilt TS4 from original media and physically inspected every component named in the explanation. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under independent audit without using the operational interface. The review of primary standard identified one consistent mechanism, DD.BORT. Consensus did not create PS4. Consensus gave the unidentified fourth reading authority, allowing every later system to reorganize around it. The mechanism explained acceptance in PS4 without explaining the first impossible reading. The primary standard mechanism accounts for authority and propagation, but not the first anomalous input. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous mechanism review value, separating absence from disagreement. The final primary standard experiment removed the remaining ordinary inputs. The empty position was removed from the comparison, and the granite bench left bare. A mechanical chart recorder drew a fourth line anyway. Outside staff witnessed the final PS4 test and preserved its result on passive media. The final PS4 test used passive evidence so an affected computer could not create the only record. Exhibit 24 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex, before it entered the final record. The formal finding in primary standard was limited but specific. The line did not match any instrument. It matched the values required to keep all 7 impossible systems mutually traceable. PS4 was the reference they shared, not the source that produced them. Investigators described the PS4 chain of acceptance more confidently than the phenomenon's origin. After primary standard, the institution changed procedure. The institute classified PS4 as an untraceable primary and prohibited its use. A parallel national measurement chain is being rebuilt from physical artifacts. The PS4 correction reduced immediate risk while removing a capability operators had begun to depend on. The corrective action after PS4 was tested against normal operation before staff accepted the lost capability. In primary standard, an independent review reproduced the result documented under institutional response without using the operational interface. One trace of PS4 remained after closure. The empty vault shelf now carries a current calibration certificate. Under Object Description, it reads, Primary Standard Present. The remaining trace from primary standard has not been reconciled with the official finding. Residual evidence from primary standard was photographed and sealed after the main systems were removed from service. The primary standard file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous residual evidence value, separating absence from disagreement. Current procedure at National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex, reflects the unresolved status of primary standard. Every comparison includes a deliberately unregistered control position so that consensus cannot silently create another authority. For PS4, the purpose is to preserve raw disagreement before automation turns it into consensus. The revised PS4 procedure requires disagreement to remain visible until a human review documents a choice. Exhibit 28 was checked against a control held outside National Institute of Measurement, Primary Standards Complex before it entered the final record. The final PS4 record states, the Institute can account for every primary standard it owns. Standard 4 is not among them. Every morning at 9 it still passes comparison. The case documented as primary standard is closed for operation and remains open for measurement.